Whispered among the mist-covered mountains of West Virginia is the name, the Appalachian Mother of Suffering, where secrets as dark as the coal that once fueled these forgotten communities are bred by isolation. For generations, the Blackwood family lived in isolation within the remote hollows of McDowell County, far from modern influence and prying eyes. What would eventually horrify doctors, social workers, and investigators alike was what happened within their secluded compound between 1943 and 1972. It was 1972 when the Blackwood compound, nestled deep in a narrow valley where sunlight barely reached the forest floor, was first discovered by local authorities. A semicircle around a central yard was formed by 7 crude wooden structures, all connected by dirt paths worn smooth from decades of use. All necessities were provided by the entirely self-contained property, which featured gardens, livestock pens, and a natural spring, eliminating any need to venture into the nearby town of Welsh. The county physician who first documented the case, Dr. Thomas Harmon, described the scene in his official report. The isolation is complete and intentional. Despite our modern era, 3 generations are living in conditions that appear frozen in time from the late 1800s. Evidence suggests that in nearly 30 years, no member of this family has interacted with outside society. Standing at the center of this compound was the matriarch, Eleanor Blackwood. Born in 1901 to coal miners, she had watched her father and brothers die in a mine collapse in 1915. According to all accounts from distant relatives interviewed later, this tragedy transformed her from a bright, sociable girl into a woman who was deeply suspicious, blaming the outside world for her family's destruction. In 1922, she married a man 15 years her senior, Jeremiah Blackwood, who owned a significant tract of mountain land inherited from his grandfather. Together, determined to create what Eleanor called a pure bloodline, they retreated from society, one that would never again be vulnerable to the dangers of the outside world. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. An extreme case of what anthropologists term genetic isolation is represented by the Blackwood family, explained Dr. Robert Collins of West Virginia University in his 1975 paper on the case. While Appalachian communities have historically been somewhat isolated due to geography, the Blackwood situation demonstrates deliberate, enforced isolation motivated by both paranoia and misguided genetic beliefs. 8 children were given birth to by Eleanor between 1923 and 1937, 5 girls and 3 boys. According to county records that were later discovered, only the first 2 births were registered with authorities. With no official documentation, no schooling, and no medical care existed the remaining children. They were, in essence, ghosts, individuals unknown to the outside world. As these children reached adolescence, a disturbing plan was implemented by Eleanor. Convinced that the family's bloodline must remain uncontaminated, she arranged marriages between her own children. When she turned 16 in 1943, the oldest daughter, Margaret, was paired with her brother, Thomas. Over the subsequent years, similar arrangements were orchestrated by Eleanor for her other daughters. A former neighbor, speaking on condition of anonymity, recalled, sometime during the war, the Blackwoods stopped coming to town. We figured they'd moved away. Nobody thought to check on them. Folks minded their own business back then. Mountain people value their privacy, and the Blackwoods were always odd. Their unbroken isolation was ensured by the property's remote location and Eleanor's strategic planning. Potential visitors were kept at bay by a series of no trespassing signs combined with rumors about vicious dogs on the property that Eleanor deliberately spread. The few who did venture close were confronted by Jeremiah, or later his sons, with shotguns and threats. By 1950, Eleanor's disturbing vision had manifested fully. A total of 13 children had been produced by her daughters with their brothers, a 3rd generation raised in complete isolation, many of whom were exhibiting clear signs of genetic complications from consanguinity. With absolute authority, Eleanor ruled within the compound. Her word was law, and her interpretations of religion and genetics were unquestionable. A twisted theology of her own was developed by her, combining misinterpreted biblical passages with deeply flawed understandings of heredity to justify her actions. In my 27 years of investigating family welfare cases, I have never encountered such a complete system of control, wrote social worker Martha Jenkins in her 1973 assessment. The adult children, now in their 40s, display the psychological markers of lifelong indoctrination. They genuinely believe a hostile world was what their mother's actions protected them from. Pure chance would eventually bring about the discovery of the Blackwood compound, a forest fire in the summer of 1972 that forced the family to evacuate toward the town, bringing them into contact with law enforcement and firefighters. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The true horrors of the Blackwood family have only begun to unfold. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the shocking details of how physical and psychological devastation that spans generations is created by genetic isolation. After the 1915 mining disaster that claimed her male relatives began Eleanor Blackwood's transformation from victim to perpetrator. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. That the explosion killed 27 miners, including Eleanor's father and 2 older brothers, is indicated by historical records from the Colwood Mining Company. 14-year-old Eleanor was described as inconsolable at the funeral in newspaper archives from the *McDowell County Register-Star. The psychological impact of sudden traumatic loss during formative years cannot be overstated, explained Dr. William Fraser, the forensic psychologist who later studied the case. For a young Eleanor, this catastrophe likely created a core belief that the outside world was inherently dangerous and that trusting external systems would inevitably lead to betrayal. According to her sister's later testimony, Eleanor's marriage to Jeremiah Blackwood in 1922 was a strategic decision. Jeremiah owned 155 acres of remote woodland and shared Eleanor's distrust of modern society following his own negative experiences during World War I. Compatible partners were made of them by their mutual desire for isolation, creating what Eleanor termed their sanctuary. From the outside, the early years of the Blackwood family appeared relatively normal. The local school in Welsh was attended by their first 2 children until 3rd grade, when Eleanor withdrew them, citing her intention to home educate. This was not uncommon in rural Appalachia in the 1920s, and authorities raised no objections. Further from society did the Blackwoods retreat between 1929 and 1937, as the Great Depression ravaged the country. In 1938 was their last documented interaction with the community, when Jeremiah purchased a significant quantity of construction supplies, seeds, and farming equipment, presumably preparing for complete self-sufficiency. The Depression era saw many Americans lose faith in institutions, noted Appalachian historian Dr. Margaret Hayes. For someone already predisposed to distrust society like Eleanor, these years would have confirmed her worst suspicions about the fragility of the modern world. Within their isolated compound, a disturbing belief system was developed and enforced by Eleanor. Mandatory daily lessons where Eleanor would lecture for hours about the dangers of genetic contamination from outsiders were described by former family members who later escaped. An elaborate mythology was created by her, positioning their family as genetically superior to others and claiming that children of extraordinary abilities would be produced by maintaining their bloodline. Eleanor had no formal education beyond 8th grade, but she possessed a dangerous combination of intelligence and charisma, wrote Dr. Collins in his assessment. She selectively borrowed concepts from eugenics literature that was unfortunately popular in the early 20th century, twisted religious teachings, and mountain folklore to create a coherent, if deeply disturbing, worldview. Secondary but complicit appears to have been Jeremiah's role in the family dynamic. Work journals recovered from the property indicate he focused on practical matters, maintaining the buildings, growing food, and hunting, while Eleanor controlled the family's social structure and beliefs. By 1943, when the first consanguineous marriage between her children was initiated by Eleanor, Jeremiah had become increasingly frail from years of hard labor and a respiratory condition likely related to his earlier mining work. Eleanor's authority within the family was further consolidated by his diminished physical state. The first to be paired with her brother was Margaret, Eleanor's eldest daughter. A handwritten marriage certificate dated June 15, 1943, signed by Eleanor as family authority and God's representative, was included in documents recovered from the compound. Margaret was 16. Thomas was 18. The psychological manipulation required to make children accept such arrangements is profound, explained Dr. Fraser. These children had been systematically isolated from all outside moral frameworks, educated exclusively by their mother, and taught from infancy that all other values were superseded by family loyalty. Over the next 7 years, similar ceremonies united Eleanor's remaining daughters with their brothers, or in some cases with their nephews. A rigid structure designed to prevent independent thought was followed by the family's daily life once the third generation reached adolescence. Labor occupied the adults from dawn to dusk, while children were subjected to Eleanor's version of education, a curriculum focused almost entirely on family loyalty, the dangers of outsiders, and preparation for their predetermined roles. A sophisticated system of indoctrination is revealed by the recovered journals and lesson materials, noted educational psychologist Dr. Susan Williams in her 1974 paper. Eleanor intuitively understood that controlling information was key to maintaining her authority. She created a closed epistemic system where all questions had predetermined answers that reinforced the family's isolation. To accommodate the growing third generation had the compound expanded by the 1960s. Eleanor's original children, now middle-aged, had fully internalized her belief system and enforced it among their own offspring. Everything they needed was created by the family, growing food, making clothes, constructing furniture, and developing their own folk medicine traditions to address health issues. However, increasingly impossible to ignore became the genetic consequences of consanguinity. Higher rates of physical and developmental complications were exhibited by the third generation. Eleanor's response was to integrate these difficulties into her mythology, claiming that these special children were evidence of the family's unique genetic destiny requiring even more protection from the outside world. "The cognitive dissonance is striking," wrote Dr. Collins. When faced with the obvious negative consequences of inbreeding, rather than questioning her beliefs, Eleanor doubled down, reinterpreting these problems as confirmation of her theories. This pattern of rationalization allowed the system to perpetuate itself even as the evidence of its harm became undeniable. By 1970, 29 individuals across 3 generations were housed in the compound, all controlled by Eleanor's unwavering vision and isolated from any counterbalancing perspectives. Most acutely by Eleanor's daughters, who bore the dual burdens of physical and psychological trauma, was the true horror of the Blackwood compound experienced. Lives defined by their mother's distorted vision and the inescapable consequences of consanguinity were experienced by Margaret, Ruth, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Catherine, the 5 Blackwood girls. Eleanor's chief enforcer became Margaret, the eldest daughter. That after her arranged union with her brother Thomas, Margaret initially showed resistance was revealed by family journals recovered from the compound. 3 escape attempts in 1944, each resulting in increasingly severe punishments, are documented in entries from Eleanor's personal diary. The process of breaking Margaret's will appears methodical and calculated, noted forensic psychologist Dr. Fraser. Eleanor understood that securing the compliance of her eldest daughter was crucial to controlling the younger children. By 1946, complete submission to her mother's ideology is shown in Margaret's writings. She began assisting in the preparation of her younger sisters for their own arranged unions, repeating Eleanor's teachings and enforcing family rules. A documented case of what psychologists now term trauma bonding, where victims come to identify with and assist their abusers, is represented by this transformation from victim to perpetrator. A different response pattern was exhibited by Ruth, the second daughter. That she developed what modern clinicians would diagnose as selective mutism, speaking only when directly addressed by Eleanor or Margaret, is indicated by medical records created after the family's discovery. 5 children were given birth to by Ruth between 1947 and 1959, 3 of whom exhibited significant developmental issues. No professional medical care or education was received by these children due to the family's isolation. Instead, what she called special teaching for these grandchildren was developed by Eleanor, a system that essentially trained them for limited roles within the compound based on their capabilities. A secret diary between 1949 and 1961 was maintained by Sarah, the middle daughter, discovered hidden in a cavity beneath her cabin floor. The most comprehensive insider account of the psychological impact of Eleanor's system is provided by these writings. "My children do not look right," Sarah wrote in 1955. "Mother says their faces show our family's blessing. But I see the other children from Elizabeth and Catherine and they look the same wrong way. I pray for forgiveness for these thoughts. Another entry from 1958 reads, I tried to tell James, her brother husband, about the world I remember from childhood, the town, the school, other people. He became angry, said I was making dangerous fantasies. Sometimes I cannot remember if those memories are real or dreams. If you're feeling the weight of this story in your heart right now, leave a comment saying, some mountains hide terrible secrets, so I know you're experiencing this journey with me. Your comments help us continue bringing these hidden historical tragedies to light. Coping mechanisms through creative expression appear to have been found by Elizabeth, the fourth daughter. Dozens of her intricate handmade quilts were recovered from the compound, many featuring unusual geometric patterns that art therapists later analyzed as potential subconscious expressions of genetic distress. Hidden within these seemingly traditional Appalachian quilts were repeating motifs of human figures with distinctive abnormalities similar to those exhibited by the third-generation children. A fascinating case of psychological processing through traditional craft is represented by Elizabeth's textiles, explained Dr. Laura Bennett, an art historian specializing in Appalachian folk art. Unable to verbally express her awareness of the genetic consequences affecting her children, she encoded these observations into her quilting, perhaps the only safe outlet available to her. The fewest children were born by Catherine, the youngest daughter only 2, both of whom showed the most severe complications. That she developed what appeared to be a prolonged postpartum psychosis after her second birth in 1954, requiring constant supervision by Margaret and Eleanor, is indicated by records. With each generation, increasingly apparent became the genetic consequences of consanguinity. Higher than normal instances of reduced cognitive function, facial asymmetry, reduced immune function, and skeletal abnormalities among the third generation were documented by Dr. Harmon's initial medical assessment of the family. A textbook case of genetic complications from inbreeding is represented by what we observed in the Blackwood family, Dr. Harmon wrote. When closely related individuals reproduce, recessive genetic traits, including those linked to disorders, have a much higher probability of expression. Strict routines established by Eleanor were followed by the daughters' daily lives. They rose before dawn for prayer sessions led by their mother, followed by domestic work, gardening, food preservation, and child care. To designated areas of the compound were their movements restricted, and interaction between families was carefully monitored. Remarkably comprehensive for its technological simplicity was the surveillance system Eleanor established, noted Dr. Williams. The cabins were positioned to allow visual monitoring from the main house. Family members were assigned to report on each other, and daily confession sessions forced disclosure of any rule violations. Perhaps most disturbing was Eleanor's manipulation of maternal instinct as a control mechanism. Her teachings emphasized that separation from the compound would result in their children being taken away and subjected to cruel treatment by outsiders. Many escape considerations were effectively prevented by this fear, particularly powerful for mothers. By the late 1960s, adolescence had been reached by the third generation, and Eleanor had already begun arranging unions among these grandchildren, creating a fourth generation of even closer genetic relationships. Growing internal conflict is revealed in Sarah's diary entries from this period. Mother has chosen for my daughter. I cannot write who. I cannot think it, but I saw Ruth's children and what happened to them. I prayed all night for God to take me before the wedding day. In various documented symptoms manifested the psychological toll on the daughters, Margaret's rigid hypervigilance, Ruth's withdrawal, Sarah's anxiety, Elizabeth's sublimated expression through art, and Catherine's psychosis. Yet, self-sustaining was the system Eleanor had built, with each generation further removed from normal social understanding and more deeply indoctrinated. A profound case study in the lifelong effects of isolation and indoctrination is represented by the Blackwood daughters, wrote Dr. Fraser. Their capacity for independent judgment was systematically dismantled from childhood, replaced with a closed belief system that, however horrifying to outsiders, provided their only framework for understanding their experiences. Durable enough to sustain Eleanor's control until external forces finally penetrated the isolation of the Blackwood compound in 1972 proved this psychological architecture. On July 18, 1972, occurred the discovery of the Blackwood family compound, when an unusually severe drought combined with a lightning strike triggered a forest fire that threatened their isolated valley. Eastward toward the town of Welsh was the family forced to evacuate as flames approached the compound from the western ridge, their first collective contact with the outside world in decades. Forest Service Ranger David Miller was coordinating evacuation routes when he encountered the group moving along an old logging road. His official report described the encounter: approximately 30 individuals of varying ages, dressed in homemade clothing consistent with styles from the 1940s. The group appeared severely disoriented and was led by an elderly woman who identified herself as Mother Eleanor. Their reaction to our vehicles and equipment suggested they had been without exposure to modern technology for a considerable time. Awareness of isolated Appalachian communities was included in Miller's training, but the family's extreme reaction to common objects like flashlights and radios immediately raised concerns. The McDowell County Sheriff's Department was contacted by him, who dispatched deputies to assist. Multiple concerning factors were quickly identified by Sheriff James Hatfield's initial assessment. Physical characteristics consistent with close familial relationships were exhibited by individuals in the group. Developmental issues were displayed by several younger members. Extreme fear of separation was demonstrated by the group, and they refused medical evaluation. Unusual control over adult members was exerted by the elderly woman. From a wildfire evacuation rapidly evolved what began into the most significant social services case in the county's history. Within 48 hours, the family's identity had been established by authorities through land records and early birth certificates for the oldest children. A coordinated response involving law enforcement, social services, and medical professionals was led to by the realization that they were dealing with an isolated, inbred family. At the Welsh Community Center was the family temporarily housed while authorities determined next steps. Initial medical evaluations were conducted by Dr. Thomas Harmon during this period, though the family's resistance hampered full assessments. Years of medical neglect compounded by genetic complications are represented by the health conditions observed, Dr. Harmon wrote in his preliminary report. Multiple individuals exhibit conditions that would typically have received intervention in childhood. The most concerning cases involve the youngest generation, where we're seeing cumulative genetic effects. Initially, remarkable control over the family was maintained by Eleanor, then 71, despite the new environment. Even without physical proximity, adult family members continue seeking Eleanor's approval before answering basic questions, observed social worker Martha Jenkins. She has established a communication system using hand gestures to direct family responses during interviews. Complex proved the legal questions surrounding the case. While the arranged consanguineous relationships clearly constituted crimes, the statute of limitations had expired for many of the original offenses. Additionally, the adults involved had been thoroughly indoctrinated and did not consider themselves victims, complicating prosecution efforts. The legal challenges were summarized by District Attorney Robert Fleming: "We're dealing with criminal activities spanning nearly 30 years, perpetrated against victims who have been conditioned not to recognize their victimization. The eldest perpetrator is now elderly, and many of the secondarily culpable individuals were themselves primary victims at an earlier stage." Significant ethical debate among authorities was generated by the case. Criminal prosecution would further traumatize a family already facing the shocking transition to modern society. However, the severity of Eleanor's actions demanded accountability. The breakthrough came when Sarah, the middle daughter, approached Jenkins privately 4 days after the evacuation. According to Jenkins' notes, Sarah requested paper to continue her diary. During this interaction, awareness that her family situation was not natural was revealed by her, and concern for her grandchildren was expressed. This represents the first crack in the family's unified front. Crucial insights into the compound structure and Eleanor's control mechanisms were gained by authorities with Sarah's limited cooperation. The intervention strategy developed by a multidisciplinary team was guided by this information. On July 27, 1972, a court order separating Eleanor from the rest of the family was executed by authorities. She was placed in custody pending psychiatric evaluation, while the remaining family members were moved to a specially prepared facility where they could remain together while receiving medical care and counseling. Varied responses among her children were triggered by Eleanor's removal. Hostile became Margaret and attempted to establish herself as the new authority figure. Acute anxiety was experienced by Ruth, requiring sedation. Increasing cooperation with authorities was demonstrated by Sarah. Into her craft work withdrew Elizabeth. Psychiatric hospitalization was required by Catherine, already psychologically fragile. Profound disorientation was shown by the third and fourth generations, having never known any authority but Eleanor and her system. Their first medical examinations, first commercially prepared meals, and first exposure to television and radio were experienced by many during this period. A specialized integration program was developed by Dr. Robert Collins, who had studied isolated Appalachian communities, and was brought in. An unprecedented challenge is represented by the Blackwood case, he wrote. Most isolated communities maintain some minimal contact with modern society. The complete severance we're seeing here, combined with the deliberate indoctrination and consanguinity issues, requires an entirely new approach. Gradual exposure to modern concepts while maintaining family cohesion where appropriate was emphasized by the program Collins developed. The adult victims were not forcibly separated unless they chose independence. That immediate separation would cause additional trauma was acknowledged by this approach, despite the dysfunctional nature of their family bonds. Extensive psychological evaluation was undergone by Eleanor meanwhile. That she suffered from a severe personality disorder with paranoid features, exacerbated by traumatic grief but falling short of psychosis, was the conclusion of Dr. William Fraser's assessment. Eleanor demonstrates full awareness of societal norms regarding consanguinity, he wrote. Her systematic efforts to prevent outside contact indicate consciousness of wrongdoing rather than delusional thinking. Based on this evaluation and Sarah's testimony, multiple counts of child endangerment and criminal neglect were what Eleanor was charged with. Given her age and health, she was ultimately committed to the state psychiatric hospital rather than prison, where she remained until her death in 1978, consistently maintaining the righteousness of her actions. Deemed uninhabitable by modern standards was the Blackwood property, documented extensively by investigators before being reclaimed by the forest. Unprecedented insights into the development and maintenance of isolated family systems were provided to researchers by photographs, journals, and artifacts recovered from the compound. The Blackwood case, while extreme, illuminates mechanisms potentially present in less severe isolation scenarios, Dr. Collins later reflected. The progression from understandable desire for privacy to complete severance from society to enforced consanguinity demonstrates how isolation itself can become a vector for increasingly divergent behavioral norms. By late 1972, the immediate crisis had stabilized, but just beginning was the long-term work of helping the Blackwood family integrate into society. Over years unfolded the aftermath of the Blackwood family discovery, revealing both the resilience of the human spirit and the lasting damage of generational trauma. Diverse paths that reflected their individual experiences within Eleanor's system and their capacity to adapt to the outside world were followed by the family members. The most resistant to intervention proved to be Margaret, the eldest daughter and Eleanor's chief enforcer. She maintained her mother's belief system and refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, despite extensive therapy. In 1975, after repeatedly attempting to reassert control over other family members, a severe personality disorder requiring structured living arrangements was what she was diagnosed with. Until her death in 1993, she remained in a supervised residential facility, never reconciling with her siblings who had chosen different paths. A gradual linguistic reawakening under the care of speech therapist Dr. Elaine Porter was experienced by Ruth, whose selective mutism had been a survival mechanism within the compound. That even severely entrenched psychological adaptations can yield to consistent, supportive intervention is demonstrated by Ruth's case, Dr. Porter wrote in her 1977 paper on the case. By 1980, Ruth was speaking in full sentences to a widening circle of trusted individuals. She eventually moved into a group home in Charleston, where purpose was found by her in caring for houseplants and helping in the communal kitchen. Though she never became fully independent, a quiet contentment was found by her, as described by staff. The strongest capacity for adaptation was shown by Sarah, whose hidden diary had provided crucial insights for investigators. With educational support, her GED was earned by her in 1976, and she eventually became an advocate for isolated Appalachian families. Instrumental in strengthening West Virginia's home education oversight regulations was her testimony before a state legislative committee in 1981. "I speak for children without voices," her testimony began, "children hidden away in hollows and hillsides who need the outside world to remember they exist." A path forward was provided to Elizabeth by her artistic abilities. Her distinctive quilting technique, which unconsciously documented the family's genetic issues, attracted the attention of Appalachian folk art preservationists. Under their mentorship, her skills were developed by her, and she eventually taught traditional quilting to university students. Unmistakably influenced by her past but never explicitly addressing it, her work was exhibited at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 1988. Encoded testimonies of survival was how her pieces were described in the catalogue. Long-term psychiatric care was required by Catherine, the youngest daughter, whose mental health had been most severely compromised. However, with appropriate medication and therapy, significant improvement was achieved by her. By the mid-1980s, she was able to live in a semi-independent setting, and a special bond with her grandchildren, who had been placed in foster care but maintained family connections, was developed by her. The most complex challenges were faced by the third-generation children, born of the arranged unions between siblings. Some of their physical health issues were addressed by medical interventions, but lifelong support services for many were required by the combination of genetic complications, educational deficits, and psychological trauma. Widely varied outcomes among this generation. Some, particularly those with fewer genetic complications, eventually achieved independence and integration into society. Others required continuing care throughout their lives. These outcomes were documented by Dr. Harmon, who continued following the family's medical cases throughout his career, in a longitudinal study published in 1992. Along a spectrum exist the genetic consequences of consanguinity, as demonstrated by the Blackwood third generation, he wrote. While some individuals experienced severe developmental issues, others manifested more subtle effects. This variation underscores the unpredictability of recessive genetic expression, even within a closely related group. Generally fared better did the fourth generation Eleanor's great-grandchildren, who had been born shortly before discovery or were young children at the time. With early intervention, appropriate education, and foster placements that maintained family connections where beneficial, many developed into well-adjusted adults. A noteworthy success story became Jessica Blackwood, born in 1966 as part of the fourth generation. Placed with a foster family but maintaining contact with her biological family, she eventually earned a degree in social work and specialized in rural community services. "I carry my family's history not as a shame, but as a responsibility," she reflected in a 1997 interview. "Their experience taught me that isolation can be both a protection and a prison, and that communities need bridges rather than walls." Significant academic research and practical policy changes were generated by the Blackwood case. Its protocols for monitoring isolated rural families were revised by West Virginia, implementing wellness check programs designed to respect Appalachian values of independence while ensuring children's well-being. The case also contributed to a broader understanding of genetic counseling needs in rural communities where historically, higher rates of consanguinity had been led to by geographical isolation. Directly to the establishment of the Appalachian Genetic Education Project, which provided non-judgmental information to mountain communities throughout the region, was led by Dr. Collins's research. Varied responses from her children were prompted by Eleanor's death in 1978 while receiving psychiatric care. Margaret refused to acknowledge her passing, while a psychological crisis requiring hospitalization was experienced by Catherine. The simple funeral was attended by Sarah and Elizabeth, but a private ceremony afterward that they described as releasing the weight of her teachings was participated in by them. Academic literature was entered by the story of the Blackwood family, and in more disguised forms, regional folklore. Reclaimed by Forest after authorities determined the buildings were structurally unsound is their compound site, which occasionally attracts curious hikers despite being officially unmarked on public maps. In 2012, a historical marker was placed in Welsh, acknowledging broadly that this area was home to families affected by extreme isolation during the mid-20th century, leading to improved rural outreach programs. The community's complicated relationship with the case is represented by this deliberately vague wording, acknowledging its historical significance while respecting the privacy of surviving family members. As rural Appalachia continues facing challenges of poverty and limited services, relevant to contemporary discussions about balancing cultural autonomy with child welfare remains the Blackwood case. How isolation, initially chosen as a protective measure, can develop into something far more damaging when taken to extremes is demonstrated by the family story. Perhaps the most insightful perspective was offered by Sarah in her final interview before her death in 2014. "Mother believed she was protecting us from a dangerous world. The tragedy is that she created a danger far worse than what she feared. Isolation itself becomes the predator when it grows too complete. If you've watched until here, it's because you connected with this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched until the end,' so I can get to know you and discover who truly appreciates the historical stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deeply researched cases of historical family isolation that shaped our understanding of genetic and social science. Like this video if you found it informative and share it with others interested in understanding the darker chapters of American rural history. These forgotten stories deserve to be remembered so we can better protect vulnerable communities.